Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Demystifying Digital Accessibility with GDS, the Government Digital Service. So GDS is the governing body responsible for monitoring and enforcing the public sector body's accessibility regulations 2018. And in today's session, we'll explore these regulations so we all have a better understanding of what they mean and how they apply to our business. We'll take a look at what we need to do now to meet the requirements. And we'll look at what's expected of us to meet the next deadline, which is only a few months away in June. But that's not all. We will look beyond the legislation and provide best practice advice around creating content and platforms that are inclusive to everyone. So stick around, we've lots of great information to share today. So before I introduce today's speakers, let's run through some housekeeping. So I'm Donna Thompson and I'll be your host on behalf of Text Help for today's session. So hopefully you're all connected to the webinar, you can hear my voice and you can see the slides. Now, if you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, you should see a little panel on the right-hand side of your screen that looks something like the one on the slide. In here, you can control your audio settings. As an attendee, you're on listen-only mode, and that is just so that everyone attending can have a good listening experience. We encourage you to ask questions though, don't be shy. Please use the questions function on the GoToWebinar panel. We'll monitor them as we go along. I'll answer as many as possible at the end of the session. So last couple of housekeeping things from me. Today's session will be recorded and we'll share the recording and the slides with you early next week. So you don't have to worry about taking too many notes. If you'd like to talk about today's session online, or if you think of any questions after the session is finished, you can reach us on the Twitter hashtag #DemystifyWithGDS. So let's meet our panelists. So today I'm very excited to be joined by Richard Morton, Head of Accessibility at GDS, and Louise Harris, Creative and Channels Team Leader at GDS. A very warm welcome to you both.
Thanks, Donna.
Would each of you like to introduce yourselves before we start? Richard, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I'm Richard Morton. I'm Head of Accessibility at GDS. I'll give more of an introduction to the actual deck, but that's the basics, yeah.
Great.
And Louise Harris, and I have one of the best jobs in government, heading up the Creative and Channels team at GDS. So we're responsible for all of GDS's external channels and creative outputs, so blogs, podcasts, videos, animation and social. And beyond that day job, I'm also involved in a cross-government group who advocates for inclusive comms best practice across the whole of digital. So I'm delighted to see so many of you here with us today.
That's great. Listen, it's great to have you both on the webinar today. I know we've got lots of things to cover. So Richard, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, so welcome everyone. Today both Louise and myself are here to talk to you about the digital accessibility regulations and how they impact on your work as communicators. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I said, I'm Richard Morton, Head of Accessibility. GDS is part of Cabinet Office and we lead the digital transformation of government, which means that we run the main government website, gov.uk, among many other things. And we have to make these things accessible, and we have to try and make government accessible. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'll just give a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this session. First, we'll talk a bit about digital accessibility and why it's important. Then I'll touch on the digital accessibility regulations that Donna just mentioned. And finally, my colleague Louise will go through some tips on how you can make communications more accessible. And there should be some time to answer questions at the end. And as Donna says, please raise questions as we go along and we'll get to those at the end. Next slide, please. So digital accessibility, what is it? Next slide, please. Accessibility means ensuring your services and content can be used and understood by the widest possible audience. In the UK, at least 1 in 5 people have a long-term illness, impairment or disability, and many more have a temporary or situational disability. And this means it's our responsibility to make sure we remove as many barriers or obstacles to accessing information and services as possible. Next slide, please. Everything we create must be accessible to everyone, regardless of whether or not they have impairments in any of these areas shown on the slide. So in the areas of vision, hearing, speech, motor or cognitive, or indeed a combination of those. For example, this means we must make sure that you don't need to rely on sight alone to understand communication material information. The text in the information should be accessible to a screen reader, which is a piece of software that's used to read out the text on a website or document for for someone who is visually impaired or blind. Similarly, we shouldn't rely on people being able to hear the audio of a film or animation and need to provide caption text for those. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that impairments aren't always permanent. People sometimes temporarily don't have use of one or more of their senses due to illness or injury, such as in this example, having an ear infection, a burst eardrum, or a cold. And we must consider people who don't have full access to things through their senses because of the situation they're in, such as being in a noisy environment that prevents you being able to hear as clearly. That might be a noisy office or being on a train. User needs need to be considered and met, whether an impairment or disability is permanent, temporary, or situational. Next slide, please. Accessibility isn't something new for GDS, though. It's built into our design standards and ways of working. But making online services accessible to all isn't just something we're passionate about, it's also the law. So we'll talk a bit about that. Next slide, please. Firstly, the Equality Act 2010, as it says on the slide, reads, we have a legal obligation to provide equal access to people with disabilities. For Northern Ireland, that's actually covered by the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. Next slide, please. In the Equality Act 2010, it says that public organisations or authorities must comply with the public sector equality duty. This means that public organisations like central and local government, healthcare and education must think about the needs of people who are disadvantaged or suffer inequality when they make decisions about how they provide their services and implement policies. That isn't just about disability, it's about all the protected qualities, protected characteristics in the Equality Act, of course, but we're focusing on disability today. Next slide, please. While the 2010 and 1995 laws have been in place for quite some time now, there are some newer online accessibility regulations that public organisations must follow. These don't replace or supersede the Equality Act or the public sector equality duty, but they're actually in addition to it and they build on it. Next slide, please. These are the public sector bodies, website and mobile applications, accessibility regulations 2018. They mean that public sector organisations have a legal obligation to make their websites and mobile apps accessible to people with disabilities. Public sector organisations are obliged to meet the latest version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that's WCAG 2.1 to level AA, and I'll explain more on this in a moment. They need to make sure their websites and apps and documents are perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. And they need to publish an accessibility statement. This will make clear the level of accessibility across the site or app. And I'll speak a bit more about this too later. Next slide, please. The UK regulations actually came from a European directive of 2016, and these have been enacted across all of the then member states of the European Union. Next slide, please. The directive says that public sector websites or apps will meet the requirements if they meet the European Accessibility Standard EN 301-549. Next slide, please. And the reference standard within that standard, EN 301-549, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 to level AA, which we've already mentioned. Next slide, please. The directive was actually put into UK law in 2018 and it started to be implemented in the year after and the following years. And so it's unaffected by Brexit. It's in UK law. It's not affected by Brexit anymore. Next slide, please. Some organisations are exempt from the regulations, including non-governmental organisations like charities, most charities, unless they're mostly financed by public funding. They provide services that are essential to the public or aimed at disabled people. But the Equality Act does still apply. Next slide, please. WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is a set of recognised guidelines that can be followed to help make components on a website accessible. These guidelines are broken down into 3 levels. Level A is for websites and documents with the most basic web accessibility features. Level AA is for websites that tackle the most common barriers for disabled users. And level AAA is for sites with the highest and most complex level of web accessibility. As mentioned earlier, level A and level AA are required for the new regulations. Going beyond that is obviously best practice, but it isn't a legal requirement. Next slide, please. There are some important dates for these regulations, and the timeline for that is shown on the slide, which I'll talk through. Websites and documents published on or after the 23rd of September 2018 already need to be compliant. That was from September 2019. So that it also includes anything created or published from now needs to be compliant with the regulations. Existing websites and documents published before that date, the 23rd of September 2018, had to be compliant by 23rd of September last year, 2020. And mobile apps, slightly different later, they have to be compliant by 23rd of June 2021, which is just 3 months away now. Next slide, please. So just going over the things that organisations need to do again, there are 4 actions they need to do to make sure they're compliant if they're in scope of the regulations. Next slide, please. Firstly, as an organisation, you need to understand how the regulations will impact you. You're likely to be impacted if you manage your website or mobile app or publish content onto gov.uk. Next slide, please. You need to check the accessibility of your website and or application, mobile app, and publish documents by carrying out an accessibility audit. It's important to engage with your digital team or accessibility champions for support on conducting accessibility audits. Alternatively, you can commission professional advice and audits through, for example, the digital marketplace. Next slide, please. Thirdly, you need to make a plan to fix any issues that come out of the accessibility audit. It's all well and good understanding what the issues are, but you do need to fix them, or at least plan to fix them over a reasonable timescale. Next slide, please. And then fourthly, one of the new requirements in these regulations is to publish an accessibility statement. They're one of the key requirements, and the statement must include certain things like how accessibility was evaluated, the level of compliance, some of the detail on known issues, how users can get accessible alternatives. That might be alternative formats for documents, for example, or alternative means of contacting. Also a feedback mechanism if there are sort of complaints or requests for alternatives. And finally, how to contact the enforcement body. Importantly, this statement must be regularly updated as and when you make changes to your website. It needs to reflect the reality of your website. We'd advise you revisit the statement at least once a year, but more often, obviously, if you make substantial changes regularly. There's a sample statement on gov.uk that can be used as a template to help you write your own. Next slide, please. In fact, there are lots of resources available to help you be compliant. Next slide, please. GDS has published guidance and other resources, as well as a link to the regulations through a campaign website called accessibility.campaign.gov.uk. And that links to a lot of useful documentation that some of that predates the regulations and helps services become more accessible. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question that often comes up is, how are these regulations monitored? Well, in fact, GDS also has a role in making sure compliance with the regulations happens. We monitor public sector websites, documents, and mobile apps for accessibility. GDS has been chosen to do this because we're a leader in online accessibility. And we're also responsible for enforcing the requirement to publish accessibility statements. Next slide, please. So what does that mean, really? Well, it's a big job to undertake. We've identified tens of thousands of public sector websites, and we have to test a sample of websites. We can't possibly test all websites, and we can't test all parts of all websites. And that sample, the numbers that we test, is based on the population size of the UK. We enforce the requirement to publish accessibility statements, and our findings are reported to the Minister for the Cabinet Office. They'll be shared with enforcement bodies and published online. Next slide, please. So while GDS is the reporting and monitoring body, enforcement of the law is slightly different. It's carried out by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Great Britain, and in Northern Ireland, it's carried out by the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, or ECNI. Next slide, please. What happens if you don't comply? Well, this means they can use their existing legal powers under the Equality Act 2010 and the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. They can launch investigations, they can issue unlawful act notices, and they can take court action against offending organisations. Next slide, please. So in summary, around this first section, all of this work, both past and present, mean that our work is accessible. This makes sure it's for everyone, and that's all of our users, including the most vulnerable. So this is for everyone. Next slide, please. Over to Louise, and I'll hand over to Louise now.
Great, thank you, Richard. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Donna, thank you. And on again, please. So I am going to, back please, sorry. I'm going to talk to you about how we make digital comms more accessible. So it's likely that a lot of you aren't responsible for building or maintaining the technical aspects of your websites or apps, but obviously accessibility isn't just about the technical architecture. As communicators, we need to make sure that the content we're creating and publishing is accessible too, and I think that's actually a really exciting area of work. Making content accessible doesn't mean compromising on your messaging or on your design, and if anything, accessibility strengthens our work. Because let's face it, there's no point having a beautiful Facebook campaign if it doesn't communicate the key messages to your audience. So today I want to share some simple practices that you can introduce to your teams to make sure that your content can be perceived and understood by the widest possible audience. Next slide, please, Donna. So first, let's talk a little bit about how language and the structure of content can be made accessible. Next slide, please. So when you're writing, it's really important to consider the different reading age levels of the public. The average reading age of the UK is actually 9 years old, and that's possibly a little bit younger than you might have thought. Long sentences can be really complicated and confusing, so as a rule, try to stick to about 25 words per sentence, or thinking about it another way, the sort of sentences people could say in one breath. Walls of text are also really tricky to read, especially on mobile devices, and can be quite off-putting for users, so we tend to advise using no more than 5 lines per paragraph. Next slide, please. So we are going to start now with a little exercise. So if you could please go to the chat function and tell me, what do you think that this sentence is trying to say? So in the example, it is a simple fact that constantly observing cold water rising in temperature until it arrives at the boiling point of 100 degrees will not, in fact, make it come to that temperature any faster than, say, staring at the nearest wallpaper. So if anyone's happy to put into the chat what they think that sentence means. Okay, so while people with a low reading age can understand this sentence, it's long and it's complicated, and it makes us do quite a lot of work to understand what it means. So compare that to what's on the next slide, please, Donna. This is the sentence simplified. Water does not boil faster if you watch it heat up. Next slide, please. So now on to headings and subheadings. So when you're structuring content, whether on a website or in a document, I think many of us are probably guilty of doing things like using bigger font size, making things bold, popping an underline to create kind of headings or to break up sections. But these things aren't understood by screen readers, which are one of the most commonly used assistive technologies. So what you do need to do is make sure that you're using the correct page structures to format your content, because that helps those people who are using screen readers to understand the layout of your document and navigate it more easily. So each document or web page should have one heading, an H1, and subheadings, so H2 or H3, that can be used to provide structure after that. You can find and edit the pre-formatted headings and subheadings within most tabs of most programs, whether that's Microsoft Word or Google Docs, or the majority of website content management systems. So you might be using WordPress, you might be using Umbraco. If you work in government, maybe you're using Whitehall Publisher, and all of those tools allow you to use those headings and add more structure to your content. Next slide, please. It's also important that you use a sensible font size, so do use your judgment when deciding which font size to use, taking into account the style of the font and the type of content you're producing, but it's just a quick and easy way to make your content more accessible. Next slide, please, Donna. So, for example, a 12-point text may be large enough for a web page, but if you're using it on an Instagram or a Facebook story, it might be more difficult to read. Your creative or design team can advise you on this. But it's also important for you as the kind of content owners to sense check the size of the font that's being used and challenge content that appears too small. As a guide at GDS, we tend to use a minimum font size of 12 for documents and 32 for presentations. Next slide, please. Quick point on link text. So link text is ultimately a hyperlink, and there are things that you can do to make them more accessible for different users. Next slide, please. So link text should be meaningful and make sense without the context of surrounding content. This is to make sure that it's accessible to users who are navigating your content with a keyboard instead of a mouse, and to those using screen readers. To meet the WCAG 2.1 AA standards that Richard mentioned earlier, you need to make sure that your links stand out from other text by underlining them and making the colour significantly different. And in terms of that colour selection, you want to be thinking about making sure there's a 3:1 colour contrast ratio between the link text and the rest of the content on the page. I'm going to touch on colour ratios a little bit more detail later in the section, but staying on links for now. Next slide, please. So as a general rule for link text, you want to start with a verb if you're asking people to do something. And if you're linking to information, link directly over the text that describes the information, as you can see from these examples where we say apply for a passport or types of election. Next slide, please. So here are some common examples of good, bad and ugly link text that I'm sure you've all come across, and maybe you've been guilty of using the click here in the past. I know I have, but let's all stop, please. Next slide, please. Now quickly touching on document formats and how to choose the right one. Next slide, please. So really, anything that you're publishing on a website should be published in HTML by default. If or when you do need to share an attachment, open document formats are probably the best option. It's compatible with most applications, and as much as you might think that they're widely used, not everybody has access to Microsoft Word or Google Docs, for example. PDFs are really only for printed documents, but if you find yourself in a situation where you are being told that you need to, or being forced to upload a PDF to your website, you should publish them as an additional document and make sure that the content is reflected in a HTML version by default. We kind of want to move people away from having PDF uploads and then please request an accessible format underneath. You know, really that HTML version is going to be meeting that user need much better. Next slide, please. So what's so bad about PDFs in the context of accessibility? Well, as I've said, their documents are actually created for print formats, so they're not built to be read and displayed on screens. They're not responsive, which makes them really challenging to open on mobile devices, and it means that they're often incompatible with screen magnification software. They usually aren't structured, so again, challenging for people who are using screen readers to actually navigate that content. We've got a good blog post on this on the GDS website, which we'll make sure is shared as part of the follow-up resources. You can learn a bit more about it. Perhaps you'll share it with the people in your organisation who are pushing PDFs on you for your website, and we hope it helps. Next slide, please. Colour. I said I'd talk to you about colour, so let's dig into that now. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So colour can be used in communication and campaign assets to add emphasis and to engage, but you really shouldn't be using it in isolation to convey a key message. Let's dig into that now. Next slide, please. So this is another quick exercise that I want you to be thinking about. I'm showing two buttons on screen, stop and start, with green and red colour applied. Do you think that these buttons are accessible? If you want to maybe jump into the chat and let us know if you think they are. Okay, interesting. So in fact, these buttons are accessible because they don't rely on colour to convey a key message. The colour is only being used for emphasis. Moving on to the next slide, please. What about these ones? Do we think these are accessible? Yeah. Take away the colour, the message can still be understood. If we could go one slide on now, please, Donna. But if you come to this, if you take the text away, what it shows us is the buttons are not accessible because it's the colour that's being used to convey the message. So if you're colourblind, you're going to find that very difficult to distinguish between these two buttons. And if you're not from a culture where red means stop and green means go, again, it's going to be challenging. Next slide, please. So colour contrast is another WCAG requirement. You need to make sure there's sufficient contrast between the colour of your text or the asset and the background that it's on. WCAG guidelines state that you should have a minimum ratio of 4.5 to 1. But how do you work that out? You know, how do you do that by eye? It can be quite tricky. So we encourage people to use a piece of software to check it. There are lots of free online tools that will do this for you and check the colour contrast between different elements. We actually use the one that's up on screen, which was developed by an ex-colleague at GDS. And if we skip on to the next slide, you'll see what it looks like when you're using that tool. So basically you fire in the Pantone codes, the colour codes that you're planning to use, and it tells you automatically and for free whether they will or won't meet the recommended contrast ratios. So it's pretty nifty. Next slide, please. So here is an example of a colour contrast that would fail WCAG standards. The orange and white combination has a low colour contrast, making it difficult to read the content. And if you compare that to the next slide, where we see an example of good colour contrast. So the green background with the white text has a contrast ratio that's actually above the minimum of 4.5 to 1. So it's much more accessible. If we move on now, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can make your kind of visual content, your video and your podcast more accessible. And I want to start with alt text. So alt text is used to describe an image. It's read by software for visually impaired users and displays when an image doesn't load. You need to be thinking about using alt text on your websites, on your social media, and even in presentations like this one. So once more in the chat, please, if you could tell me, what would you think? What if you were writing alt text for this image? What would you say? Okay. Next slide, please, Donna. So for this one, I'd actually just describe it as pancakes. Unless there is a need to provide a really detailed description of the image, it's not always necessary to include a lengthy alt text description. You just need to use your judgment to determine what information is necessary to provide users with the same experience of the content as if they were able to see it. Next slide, please, Donna. So some tips. I think keep it short and simple, include only the information that the users need to know about the message that the image is conveying. So for example, that previous image, does the user need to know what type of table those pancakes are on? Probably not, unless it's in a very unusual setting. You don't need to include things like picture of, graphic of, image of in the alt text description. And it's not just about your kind of primary on-screen content, you know, your images and your banners. It's also important to add alt text to design elements, so buttons when you're creating marketing emails, for example. Next slide, please. So let's think about subtitles and captions. So the majority of video content now is actually viewed without audio, so many creators are already including subtitles or closed captions. If you're not sure of the difference, subtitles are burned in, so they're part of the video, they can't be switched off, whereas closed captions are optional and give the user more flexibility. Subtitles are generally designed for viewers that can hear the audio but who aren't fluent in the language that's being used, whereas closed captions are designed for those who cannot hear the content. We tend to see closed captions as the preferred choice, as they offer more flexibility for users, so they can turn them on and off, and some browsers will also allow them to customize how they're displayed. When you come to create yours, think about using an accessible font like Arial and make sure that the text is large enough to actually be legible. Again, this is where color contrast between the text and the background that it's sitting on comes into play, and as tempting as it might be to kind of play around with the colours of your subtitles and add a jazzy combo that fits your campaign, it's probably best to stick with the default caption pairing, which is usually a white background with black a white text on a black or grey background. So I'm inverting myself. Next slide, please. You can do some other things to improve the readability of your subtitles by making sure there's sufficient padding. So padding is the space between the text and the background edge. Most of you will probably not change the padding on preset subtitles, which is great. But if you do like to tailor it, or you're working with a producer or a creative agency, just advise that they aim for at least 1/3 colour padding around your subtitle. Next slide, please. So now on to a bit more on video and also animations and GIFs. So you need to be thinking about a video description being available for all videos without audio. And it doesn't need to be complex. It's just a body of text that uses plain English to describe the key visual elements in the video, so users who can't watch the content can have the same information as someone who can. You want to make sure you're including a voiceover. Something we're seeing a lot more of on social media is videos which have subtitles but with no voiceover. So that's great if, for people who can't see the content, but what if somebody is visually impaired? Having captions or subtitles and a voiceover will make your video content that much more accessible to that many more people. When you're using backing tracks on your videos, there needs to be a clear distinction between this and any other audio. Work to a minimum of about 20 decibels difference between background music and any voiceovers. And think about your transition times between scenes in videos and GIFs so that the audience can really have a chance to follow your content. There's no set transition speed. It's going to be dictated by the kind of content you're doing and the messages that you need to land. But as a guide, again, you can think about the average reading speed for people, which is about 200 to 250 words a minute. Quite a lot of people at the moment using sort of strobe content in their videos, very impactful, but you need to be aware that flashing images can also cause seizures. WCAG requirements outline that web pages should not contain anything that flashes more than 3 times a second. And at GDS, that's thinking that we carry forward in other places, such as the GIFs or animations that we use on social media. I know that there's a lot to take in on this particular section, but just to let you know that we're going to be sharing some guidance that GDS put together with the Government Communication Service last year, and that dives a lot deeper into the kind of video animation accessibility and outlines some helpful scenarios that we hope that you'll be able to take forward. So that's going to be in the post-event comms as well. Next slide, please. So podcasts. So if you create podcasts, please do remember to publish a transcript with the content, and don't forget that that transcript should please be in HTML or embedded within a web page, no PDFs, please. Next slide. Social media. So many of the tips we've shared with you will actually, inform and apply the content for your social media accounts, but there are a few additional things that we wanted to talk to you about. Next slide, please. So the first is to limit your hashtags, maybe 2 per post, as this will improve the flow of the text. It's also helpful to capitalise the first letter of individual words to improve the readability and to enable more screen readers to understand the content. If you want more information on that, you need to look for camel case online. People who navigate via keyboard shortcuts often find it frustrating to navigate multiple links, so we recommend you limit links to 1 per social post. And alt text is a feature on most social media platforms now, so use it as you would for images elsewhere. It takes seconds to do, but it makes a really big difference to users. What else? Next slide, please. Don't rely on images alone to convey your campaign key messages, so make sure that if you're posting kind of graphics or quotes, that they're also included as information in the post copy. And if you can, it's best to avoid pictures of PDFs entirely on social media. It makes it really challenging for people who are using assistive technologies. But if on those occasions where you have to, for example, to demonstrate trust or reassurance that a particular letter signed by a particular person was sent, and you need to include that PDF in your social post, please make sure that there's a text alternative that you can point people to somewhere else. Most social media networks now actually have pretty good built-in accessibility features, so just keep an eye on those, switch them on and familiarise yourself with the features as they come online. And then a final point with our final slide. We are constantly communicating with our audiences through surveys, email marketing, job adverts. It's not just about making our social and our web content accessible. So just encourage you to take the time to review the different channels and software that you're using, and think about how you can take small steps to make them more accessible. You know, after all, success of comms and campaigns lies in engaging an audience. So the first step is making sure that they can actually access and understand the message in order to take those actions you want them to. That's it for me. Thanks everybody for listening, and back to you, Donna.
Lovely, that's great. Thanks, Louise, and thanks to Richard. The legislation is certainly a little bit clearer in my mind, and you've shared lots of really great advice that we can all apply to our own setting. Louise, some of the things you mentioned earlier, like adding alt tags to images and using the descriptive text and hyperlinks, these things seem really easy to do. I guess it's just remembering to do them every time, and remembering that our audiences are diverse, so we really must consider their needs in everything we do, make it part of our DNA. So listen, it's usually at this point in the webinar where we introduce an organisation as a case study to talk us through their practical experiences and learnings. But this time the case study is TextHelp. We don't usually talk about ourselves on our webinars, but this time we are making an exception. And it's really because we're almost at the end of a huge website relaunch. And we've learned, quite a lot along the way in terms of making it accessible and inclusive. And we'd really like to share those learnings with you all today so that we can all benefit from them. So just to start off by giving you a very brief background into who we are and why we care so much about accessibility. Our mission is to unlock people's potential through the use of technology. And it's our vision for a world where difference, disability, or language are no longer barriers. So we've been around for 25 years now, and we are the global leader in creating inclusive technologies that are used in schools, in homes, and in workplaces all around the world. We have over 30 million users of our software, and we're the company behind products that you may have heard of, such as Read and Write, and that's used to support neurodiversities and boost everyone's productivity, and Browse Aloud, our digital inclusion toolbar that organisations can add to their website to provide reading and translation tools to their web visitors. So accessibility is really at the heart of everything that we do. It really is part of our DNA. We're passionate about inclusion and about ensuring that everyone can understand and be understood. But as we were reminded recently, it's not always easy to achieve. So listen, we knew it was time to build a new website. Our business had grown and our business model had changed too. So we were now offering products that were fully SaaS or cloud-based. So we really needed a website to better reflect this. Also, our website had grown massively over the last couple of years, and it was really just becoming difficult for us to manage, and this was far from ideal, especially since traffic to our site has risen massively since COVID. I'm sure many of you have experienced similar increases in traffic for the same reasons. For us at TextHelp, the traffic to our site has risen by 120% year on year since COVID, and usage of our digital inclusion toolbar Browse Aloud has risen by 400%. So you can see it was extremely important for us that our new website was not just accessible, but inclusive too. We really wanted it to be usable by everybody, regardless of ability, native language, the device they were using to navigate the site. So look, we put together a 5-step plan, and we just want to share that with you today. So step one was to audit our current site. We knew that building a new website from the ground up wouldn't happen overnight. So before we started this mammoth project, we decided to audit our current site and fix any issues that really needed addressed now. So not just WCAG compliance issues to stay above the law, but considering the reading age in the UK that Louise mentioned earlier is just 9 years old, we wanted to go beyond accessibility and look for readability barriers too. We also wanted to take the opportunity to just see how Browse Aloud was being used across our site, which tools were the most popular and on which pages. So we needed an auditing tool. And of course, when you look at the market, there are a number of tools to choose from. But after testing some of these tools, we just couldn't seem to find one tool that we needed to do all of the things that we needed it to do. So we built our own. Look, we are in a really lucky position to have an amazing team of developers who had both the capability and the capacity to respond pretty quickly to our demands and get to work on our very own auditor. So look, while our developers were busy developing, we got to work on finding out how usable our site was. And this is really where we encountered our next hurdle. We had no hard data on the usability of our site. Of course, we had anecdotal evidence and stories from our own experiences, but that really wasn't quite enough to build a user-centric website. So we decided to run a series of user experience testing sessions. So we asked for feedback on how our audiences use our website and really what they expected to see in certain pages. It was so interesting. The sessions gave us insights into which page layouts maybe just weren't working so well, which areas people struggled with the most or found confusing, and which areas we lost them altogether. So this really helped us to build that fully user-centric website right from the start. So fast forward, Auditor Tool was built. So by step 2, we were in a really great position to easily find and fix issues on our site to immediately improve its performance. We were able to start with the most critical issues on the most visited pages and really work our way down to the smaller issues on the less visited pages. We found errors actually that we really would have struggled to find with a human eye. It certainly would have taken us way longer if we didn't have the Auditor Tool. So our next step was to make sure that we built auditing into our new web design project right from the start, and to continue to find and fix errors as we go along, instead of waiting until the end of the project. So auditing our current site, when we did, really was a necessary first step for us before we started building the new site. But retrofitting is just not ideal. It can be tricky, it can be time consuming. We certainly learned this the hard way, but it's much better to build this into the project, as I say, from the beginning. So step 4 is when we really started to get to work on the new site. So all the top level planning, the UX and wireframes were complete. It was time to build. And to regularly audit and iterate as we went along. And this really meant we had to work way more collaboratively than ever before with that wider project delivery team. So the team was made up of web and UX designers, graphic designers, and content writers. And it was really important for us to get the right people collaborating on this project right from the beginning. We weren't just creating a website that ticks the accessibility box on launch day. We really want to maintain a consistent level of accessibility and usability as the website grows long after launch. So the team checked in with one another daily, and this was to iron out any immediate blockers the team were experiencing. They also met weekly to take a bigger picture view on how the project was developing and really ensure the decisions that were being made were in keeping with the goals to be user-centric, accessible, and inclusive. And they also used the auditor to scan the new web elements for compliance errors so they could be fixed as the project progressed. So it wasn't just about technical fixes either. We know that website content is written once, but it can be read 1,000 times. It's really important that we get the content right too, if we want our website to be successful. So over the last couple of months, our content writers have been working to ensure our website is easier to understand and really has been created with our users front of mind. So the continual auditing throughout the build really put ourselves in the mind of our diverse web audience. So for example, when we were thinking about navigation, we were asking ourselves, how easy is it for our web audience to find what they're looking for, understand it when they find it, and take the preferred action independently. For language, we thought about our messaging. Was it clear? Easy to understand? Were we using jargon words unnecessarily? Could we do better? And not just on our web pages, but in our alt tags too. And then for branding, for example, we looked at our colours. Did we have enough contrast between background and foreground colours? Were we using only colour anywhere to convey meaning? So stopping to think about these areas really helped us to improve on the approach that we took. So final step, the go live, and this really is the most difficult step, I think, to take. It takes great courage. And I guess if I was to ask myself, are we ready? The perfectionist in me is going to say no. But to quote one of my very favourite humans, Brene Brown, she says, perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from taking flight. So I want our new website to take flight, be seen, be found. Is it perfect? No, but it is a vast improvement on our current site, and we're definitely going in the right direction. It's already WCAG AA compliant, and we won't stop making it better so that all of our audiences have a good user experience and find what they're looking for on our site with ease and speed. So when we go live later this month, it will be a beta version, and this is so that we can gather first impressions and feedback from our engaged users and make any improvements that we might have missed along the way. So what's next for us? Well, our website is just one channel that we use to communicate to our audiences. It's the biggest for sure, but it is still only one channel. Building our new website has given us a new mindset. We're much more mindful of accessibility and readability, and we want to carry this mindset into all of our communications. So how are we going to do this? Well, lots of ways really. So what we've done is outlined an accessibility roadmap, and this is to take us through the next 12 months. It currently consists of 7 key landmarks that we want to reach. I am very mindful of the time that we have left today, so I will run through this fairly quickly, but I'm happy to talk about this more after the session or at the end of the session if you want more detail. But first up, we want the whole company to understand what we mean by accessibility. We'll share best practice and guidelines with everyone so we can all get into this mindset of accessibility first. In the same vein, we want to provide accessibility training to our staff too. And this has already started. I had plain English training yesterday, which was so interesting. I have a lot to learn. Additionally, we want to encourage a representative from each department to become an accessibility champion, be the voice for accessibility, and really help keep accessibility front of mind in everything that we do. Of course, we want to continue to build accessibility into our product portfolio. It may seem like an obvious step, but definitely worth adding to our roadmap for completeness. And the next one I've talked about already, and that is to launch a more accessible website, one that remains accessible and inclusive long after it's launched and not just for launch day. So that's definitely very important to us. So fifth on the list is to source a more accessible social media management platform, one that allows us to add alt text to social images before we publish them, for example. This has been a bit of a headache for our social media team. And as our business grows and we publish more across multiple social channels, this process is just not efficient, never mind the obvious accessibility issues that it creates. Next on the list is to improve our videos and webinars. So as you can see, we're already using captions on our webinars, but we want to make sure that all of our videos are accompanied by a transcript going forward. We also want to move to a more accessible platform for our webinars, really just to give our listeners and our presenters a more inclusive experience as they join us. And last on the list for now is to improve the readability of our content. And I'm going to talk a little bit now just about how we are going to do that. So in addition to the auditor that I mentioned earlier, we also created an editor, and it has been helping us to write better in real time. It's honestly like having a plain English teacher sitting on your shoulder when you write. I know that sounds really annoying, but actually it's super helpful. So it highlights spelling and grammar mistakes, and let's be honest, we all make them, especially when we're in a hurry or we're distracted by balancing many things at once. It also highlights any jargon words and long sentences that we might want to edit before publishing. But the one thing that I love the most about the editor is that it tells me what age the readers would likely need to be to understand my words. So now I can make sure that my writing is more suitable for the target audience. So it's definitely made me more mindful when I write, but it's not just us marketing folks who write. All staff write emails or share information across staff networks or social networks, and the editor can help us all write better across all of these channels. So we're currently sharing these great tools with our colleagues across the business so that our communication channels are more inclusive. But listen, enough about us. I really could talk about our accessibility journey all day because we are constantly learning new things and making improvements as we go along. But if you'd like to learn more about anything that I've very quickly talked about today, delve deeper into the challenges that we've encountered or learn more about the tools we've created, then please do get in touch. I've actually added a link to the slide there just at the last minute. We're running a webinar next week to introduce our customers to these new tools, and you're more than welcome to come along and see what they look like and see if they will be useful to you. So I've popped the registration link, pardon me, onto the slide. If there's anything that we can do to ease or shorten your own journey, we want to help. So listen, that brings us to the end of the presentations. I know we covered a lot in a very short space of time. And I know you have a ton of questions. I've been seeing them coming through. So let's see how many of them we can answer in the last 10 minutes or so that we've got left. Richard and Louise, would you like to switch your webcams on for this last bit? And I'll take a nosy and see what questions have come through in the meanwhile. Okay. So we'll start with this one then. So it's WCAG 2.1. So is WCAG 2.1 compliance sufficient for government websites at the moment, or should we be looking at WCAG 3?
Depends what you mean by sufficient. In terms of regulations and the strict requirements, yes, WCAG 2.1 is the requirement. It's not enough to make things fully accessible. You know, it's just a baseline. We shouldn't be looking at WCAG 3 yet. That's quite a long way off. WCAG 2.2 is currently being developed, but again, it's very much an early draft. You know, I don't know exactly when that'll go in place. Don't worry about that at this stage. Stick with WCAG 2.1, yeah.
Great, okay. So some rules for private sector and third sector here. Will we ever see a version of the public accessibility regulations for private companies? Yet how many websites online feel accessibility?
Don't know, to be honest. There's been a lot of talk about that across Europe and in the UK, and in some places they have actually done that. So in Norway, for example, which put these regulations in place, even though they weren't part of the EU, they did go for the whole sort of private commercial sector as well as the public sector. In many ways, that makes it a simpler thing to monitor and to do, but I don't know, you know, whether the political powers that be will go down that route or not. Don't know if you have any views on that, Louise.
No, I mean, I think it's great that we're working towards a levelling up across the whole of the public sector, and obviously, as Don has outlined, you know, as we do this work, we're learning lots as we go along, and it would be really great for private sector entities to take that on board, because of course they need to deliver a great user experience too. But as Richard says, TBC whether that ever makes it into sort of legislation or not.
Great, okay. What is the duty towards people with learning differences? And there's also a similar question about people who are deaf.
This is mostly covered by the sort of principle of being understandable, and a lot of it comes down to using plain English, avoiding jargon, explaining acronyms and abbreviations wherever possible. The duty is really to make sure that everything works for everyone, and you know, anything that confuses can be a problem cognitively, both in terms of, you know, disabilities, like you know particular disabilities or difficulties, but also just in terms of stress, anxiety, things like that. No, I don't mean just in terms of, but if someone is stressed, they find it much more difficult to complete a form, for example, if it's complex, if it's asking questions that aren't needed. And the whole business of just making sure that things are kept as simple as possible. You know, we've been trying to recommend this stuff for years, that if you're asking questions, you do one thing per page, you keep things simple, you don't ask questions you don't need to. So there's a lot around that. There isn't so much particularly within the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines themselves at level AA or level A. So it's from the sort of regulations point of view, it's more best practice, but it's definitely really important.
Great, okay. Couple of questions about accessibility audits. Do we have to do them annually? Does an organisation, a learning management system, have to have an accessibility statement?
The first part of that, no, there's no particular requirement for how often you have to do an audit, and how you do the audit is it kind of entirely up to yourselves as an organisation. It just makes sense to do it if you're regularly changing things. Even if you're not regularly changing things, there are external factors that come into play, like browsers change, tools change, and you know, assistive technology changes. So it's important to sort of check that every so often. So, you know, I'd say annually if you can, but it depends on the resources of your organisation. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Oh, I've skipped on past it now. It was about learning management systems. So an organisation that has a learning management system, are they required to also have an accessibility statement?
It depends. A lot of my answers are it depends. But in technical terms, in terms of the regulations, if it's an older system, what's called an intranet or an internal system, you don't have to do anything particularly for the new regulations. If it's a new system or it's been substantially changed since the regulations came in, then you will need to make sure, A, that it meets the requirements, and B, that it does have an accessibility statement. How you publish that is up to you, because that's an internal type of system, but you need to make it staff aware of where they can get help and how, you know, how accessible it is. All those sort of things still apply.
Okay,
And I
great.
think that sort of speaks to the point about, you know, the law is the law and the regulations are really important. But even if you're not in scope of the regulations and don't have to publish an accessibility statement, that doesn't mean that you don't want to make your tools and systems as user-friendly as possible, because an employee learning platform that up to 1/5 of your employees can't use is chocolate teapot territory in my mind.
Mhm. Great. A couple of questions about PDFs. I thought we'd gotten more actually, but just a couple. So one is, some of my staff want to upload PDF posters onto the intranet to allow other teams to print. Is it okay to upload this PDF and comment that it is intended for printing?
I think that makes sense, because that's the PDF doing what the PDF is meant to be done. I think it's you know, where you get people saying, oh, we've written a press release, let's upload it to the website as a PDF, and you think, well, that's madness. But certainly on our own accessibility regulations campaign website, we have got PDFs uploaded on there where we have structured them as best as possible, but they are clearly marked as print these resources off, pop them on your walls, spread the word. So I think in that instance, Richard, unless you say otherwise, that makes sense.
No, I'd echo that advice. Yeah, printed PDFs just for printing are okay. Yeah.
Great, okay. And then another one, is it acceptable to publish a longer PDF with only a summarized version in HTML?
I would say no. Well, you want to get your information in front of the right people, and you want them to be able to perceive it and comprehend it. So really giving an abridged version in an accessible format is not meeting the user need, because you're just creating inequality in who can access your information and who can't. So that would be a no in my book.
Yeah, I'd also add that I don't think it's necessarily the best approach to to transfer a PDF, a long PDF, into a single web page. I think it makes more sense to think about, could this be a mini website or a sub-site or something like that. If you think about an annual report, for example, there's usually dozens of pages in there. It doesn't make sense for that just to be in one page and readable. So it's kind of a cultural shift as well as a technical change, if you like.
Okay, one about fonts, actually. I know you mentioned this, Louise. So is there a recommended font that we should be using? And a font size, is there a recommended font size? I know you covered that a little bit.
So font size for your sort of standard web pages or documents that we're sending around to one another, probably 12. Remember, you know, people will be able to use screen magnification software, so you don't need to be making your emails massive. Do think about that. About 32 point for presentations. We use Arial, but there is actually a body of work going on at the moment into the kind of readability of different fonts. So I wouldn't say that there's a cut and done, you know, one and done, this is an accessible font. It's an emerging area, but certainly ones which are cursive or designed to look like handwriting would be less accessible than something like Arial or Helvetica Neue or things like that.
Great, okay.
Yeah, I'd add that there isn't a lot of research around, you know, whether particular fonts are better than others, but generally simple fonts are better than others. And as Louise says, there's a study going on. I think that's through the BBC. There's been work done when they created their new Wreath font face, for example. They did a lot of work, and I know Gareth Ford-Williams of the BBC is very keen on that topic. So if you follow him on Twitter or whatever, you'll see stuff about that.
Lovely. Okay, well, listen, looking at the time, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap things up here. But what a great session. So much to take back into our own organisations. But listen, if we didn't get to any questions, I'm sure there are loads more there that we didn't get to. Don't worry, we will get back to you directly after the session. So I really want to thank our panellists, Richard Morton and Louise Harris, for joining us today from GDS and sharing their wealth of knowledge on accessibility legislation and best practice. Guys, thank you so much. I don't know if you have any final thoughts for our listeners before we go. Richard, I'll maybe come to you first.
Sure, just a reminder really that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the legislation, they're not really there to make people meet the requirements of the legislation. They're there to sort of back up that everything we do needs to be accessible. I mentioned, you know, this is for everyone. We need to think about this in a sort of holistic way, that this is just one tool in the armor of, one tool in the armor, if that's the right expression, of getting things more accessible, making things more inclusive. So, you know, just think of this as a baseline, if you like.
Great.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, especially when you're thinking about accessible comms. Accessible comms are just better comms, they're more impactful, they reach more of the people that you need to, and it's actually a really exciting area to focus on. So I would just say build it into your teams, make it like proofreading and fact checking. It's just part of what you do, and I promise you, you'll reap so many rewards.
Lovely. Well, listen, that's it for today, folks. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your week. But it's bye for now.